the thing doing the field goal. Like, woo! That was when we wanted to have our black party with our black friends. I'm like, I'm in.
Welcome to Higher View. It is going to be a crazy, wonderful day. So today we are talking about education. Today is our Education Healthcare Day. So today we're talking about education, and we have Michelle Hutchison with us. We've got Dr. Ivy back. Yay! And we're going to be talking about cognitive intelligence, emotional intelligence. Of course, Spirit always throws in there spiritual intelligence.
Thank you.
And all kinds of wonderful stuff. So, and how that affects our kids, how that's going to affect their output, right? Mm-hmm. And also how it's going to affect the adults and how we can come in and support that as parents and volunteers and all that kind of good stuff. So Julie, why don't you introduce Michelle for those that aren't familiar with her, and we'll just see where Holy Spirit takes it.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Michelle and I have just recently gotten to know each other through Women in Ministry Network with Patricia King. We were on a call and we just had a chance to share what was going on in our season and in our life. And I think it was just 3 or 4 weeks ago, maybe, Michelle, where she was sharing what she was doing with the social and emotional intelligence learning through the legislation system, getting involved more in the schools in Michigan. And my heart was just like, I need to talk with this woman because of what we're kind of doing through our Creative Arts and Therapy Center. We just have the same kind of wavelength. And I love getting around people that make me think more and get me to a perspective that maybe I'm not aware of. And so we had a conversation over the phone for, I don't know what, an hour, Michelle?
Yeah.
And it could have just continued to go on, but we of course have things to do. We're busy women. And then, you know, Dr. Ivy, I was like, you need to connect with Michelle. And so I kind of did a little partnering with the two of them. So they've had some side conversations going back and forth. So it's just been really fun to be able to see Dr. Ivy and Michelle connect and engage because they're on a whole other level. And then over here, I kind of get to be in the middle to kind of see and hear what's going on. So I love having both of you guys on. This is so exciting. So why don't you tell a little bit about, Michelle, what you're doing? Of course, you're a licensed family counselor. You've been doing stuff in the education with social and emotional intelligence. We know that we can never cap out on our social and emotional intelligence. And I think this is something that we as society need to increase even more, especially with what we're facing. So go ahead and share kind of what you're doing and your little bit of your background and how you became passionate about this subject.
Yes. Hi, Julie. Thank you so much. Thank you, Melissa. I'm excited and I'm so happy to be here with Dr. Ivy too. I can call her my good friend now. So I love that. You know, I'm so passionate about this conversation because really we're looking at the whole development of a person or of children. And so just to back up a little bit about my history, I've worked in the clinical field for years and years. And then as I branched out in my work, I really focused on trauma and what it looks like to experience trauma in our lives and how that impacts our brains and our thinking and ultimately our functioning. And so I began to train on trauma, and that training consisted of all different audiences: educators, parents, foster parents, religious environments, community conferences. And I just got really excited about the idea that we can understand our behavior from a different perspective. And then that leads us into the conversation of what does it look like to heal, and where does that healing come from, and how can that healing be more than just behavioral, but become physiological healing that happens in our brains, which then just leads you into the whole conversation of how we know that there's so much opportunity to grow our brain and to change our behavior and to change our thinking, which is new understanding in the field of neuroscience. In the last 20 years, we used to just always believe that once you were developed, that's who you are, that's how you think, and that's your potential. And we know now that that's not true. And of course, if you take the understanding of faith, we really must believe that
Okay.
that we can always grow and we can always change and we evolve into higher beings, right, of understanding and knowledge. So as I brought my clinical understanding into the field of education, I began to look at what's really happening in our education system for our children and also our teachers. You know, we have to talk about both at the same time. We can't just speak about our children because our teachers are in a system that's really overwhelming for them and often leaves them feeling some toxic stress and trauma too. And so I just began to really study that environment and think about, okay, what's happening here clinically and cognitively for children? Because we often look at the field from a very academic perspective.
Right.
How do we grow cognitive intelligence in the sense that we're educating children, but are we really looking at the psychological development of our kids, and are we really looking at how we relate to them in an education system and what the impact is on the brain? And so that just really moved me into the study of resilience and understanding how we focus on social and emotional learning in an education system from the perspective of neuroscience or neuropsychology, meaning we're just bringing together the whole picture and focusing on the whole child and the development of the whole person, both adult and child, to really bring best outcomes. And so my work is really advocating for the development of the whole person and building equity and equality in the brain. And that's such an important topic right now. Yeah.
So good. Well, I love how your integrated approach, and we just see this really throughout, different sectors of society. I think predominantly, the medical field and how, they're beginning to approach medicine, integrated medicine. We hear about that all, integrated nutrition, integrated medicine. And we really do, just as a society as a whole, need to stop compartmentalizing our processes of growth and development, regardless if it's, integrated medicine and the study of how does X, Y, and Z affect the whole person instead of, oh, you have cancer. We're just going to focus in on the cancer versus, the entire body and the systems and how they're all reacting and where it came from. And is the remedy going to create 10,000 different issues? Our education system, as you're sharing this, I'm like, oh my gosh, we've been so compartmentalized even in the education system, and I have 3 boys, all 3 vastly different learners, and my first one, my oldest one, could pretty much sleep through school and have, a 4.5 GPA type of a thing. And is my biomedical engineer guy. And, my middle child, who was just as intelligent, but not as, driven and interested. We literally thought, oh, he's going to be kind of like the BC student. And are you giving it your best? And it was like, yes, yes, yes. Until actually he was going into his junior year in high school. And he was like, I'm done with school. And literally completed 2 years in 7 months. And got straight A's. And I was like, wait a minute, so that was just a different, part of his social and emotional, intelligence and how it was going to apply to this, cognitive output. And then, my youngest, who's a typical, the youngest, and trying to figure out, his thing. But we have to look at the whole person instead of being like, oh no, you have to do this step and this step and output XYZ from this standardized test. And that's the only thing that's affecting anything. And that's just so leaving. I mean, you guys probably know the statistics way better than me, but it seems like it's leaving, 3/4 of the students out there as failures and only the one student that operates best in that compartmentalized environment flourishes.
You're absolutely right. We're working with a system that really theoretically hasn't been changed in many, many years. And we would never see a physician who hadn't updated their practices in years and years and years, right?
Right.
And so, I mean, there's so much in what you've just said, because you're right. We understand clinically that our physical health is impacted by our emotional health. Right? We don't always think about it in that sense, but when we experience trauma, our bodies hold that physical memory, which then impacts our physical health. And we can connect many diagnoses to emotional trauma or life experiences or toxic stress. We know now in the ACEs research, which is, assessments that we give in the field of trauma to say, what's your experience with living in traumatic experiences. With a certain score of ACEs, you can see up to a 20-year life expectancy difference. Wow. Because that's how much our emotional experiences impact our physical health. And so then we have to look at this conceptually with how much are our emotional experiences impacting our ability to learn and grow, right? And evolve as thinkers. And what does that stress look like on children? But also the exciting news is that children's brains are very resilient. Right. And so what is our responsibility in an education system to really meet the needs of the neuropsychological development in our children? And we have compartmentalized. We haven't often looked at that. We've just thought about how do we grow their intellectual intelligence.
Yeah.
So we have to look at both.
In this, particularly, and not that everybody out there watching the show, not that I'm literally trying to make everything about race. However, this is on the spigot right now with what's going on. So, I'm not an education expert or a medical expert or any of that kind of stuff. But I'm just thinking and processing. So in the school system, and let's say you have, a school system in, I don't know, a predominantly wealthy area, they're teaching, the whatever federal mandated, curriculum is, to a bunch of students who the worst thing that happens to them is, they didn't make it to the big soccer tournament or something, right? Versus an area that is more impoverished, and you have children that are predominantly living in single parent households, gunfire, going on, as we are addressing, right now in the nation, the racism. I mean, the high stressors, death, divorce, and financial struggles. So how do we get into, how do we even the playing field? Not just saying, well, here's the federal curriculum that everybody across the nation has to learn. But if our learners are in such high stress, traumatic, or trauma filled environments, how do we make those adjustments so that they, there's not that disparity in end results, I guess.
Yeah,
that's no fault of the child.
I love this conversation. And Dr. Ivy, you can feel free to jump in anytime too, because your research has been based around a bit of this. But, Melissa and Julie, that's the conversation for this time, right? That we understand that poverty and oppression absolutely impact cognitive development. And let me just back up for a moment and say, because when as a child you're living in certain circumstances, your brain begins to function out of fight, flight, or freeze. That let me survive mode instead of, and that's a brain chemical state.
Yeah.
So your brain chemicals are in this place of high levels of cortisol, et cetera, and it makes it hard for the logical development, that left side of the brain, to really grow, because your brain is always just fighting the chemical state.
Yeah.
So then what's happening, you have to ask the question, what's happening with those neural pathways and synapses in the brain? How are we connecting one pathway to the next, which is what grows our thinking. Our thinking occurs through neural pathways, right? And so when we're not in a place where we can think, and then through our thoughts, we develop more and more connections, which increases our brain growth. We then lose not the ability to, because we always have the ability to think and grow, but we lose time in the sense that our brains are growing and developing, especially as young children. I did a lot of study in infant mental health, right? We understand that those early ages, there's so much that occurs in that early stimulation of the brain. Eye contact, manipulation with our hands, etc., early exposure to concepts and to thinking and to verbal language when our parents are asking us lots of questions. So really, if it comes down to poverty or lack of exposure to understanding how to develop your child, or if you just don't have a lot of experiences that grow those connections in the brain, then it does absolutely impact your thinking, and it does absolutely impact the physiological makeup of the brain. And so I love to talk about it from this perspective. How do we build equity and equality, especially in an education system? We develop those neural pathways in the brain, and that requires us to bring some psychological safety, not physical safety, psychological safety, and that's another whole conversation, to an education setting or to a classroom or from adults to learners, so that those brain chemical states can be reduced and then learning can increase. And then we teach thinking capacities. We know that the brain can be broken down into 28 different cognitive capacities. So if I never learn to take perspective, and then you put me in an education setting where I don't know how to think from your perspective, or you accidentally throw your pencil and it hits me, and I think that you purposely tried to hit me, and so then we have a fight because I haven't built the pathway in my brain to think with perspective, then all of a sudden I find myself in conflict over and over. And so we do have to look at what happens in our education system when one family can afford a $25,000 education at Montessori, where a child's developing those neural pathways from early ages, and then another child doesn't even have access to Head Start, and then maybe there's less stimulation going on at home. Parents are busy with work, or they're not there, and so all of that builds an inequity in the brain, right? We're not starting out on the same footing. And so how are we responsible as an education system to bring that equity into the system and begin to build children up from a neurological perspective? It's a great question that really needs to be dug into more, but there's more and more research out there. And Dr. Ivy can talk to how we begin to individualize through different styles of learning the way that we teach children. For example, project-based learning versus what the traditional classroom looks like now.
Well, and something you said just a few minutes ago, as far as the psychological safety in the classroom, and it brought me back to a memory when my oldest was, I don't know, I think he was in elementary school. I can't remember, which grade, 4th, 5th, 6th grade. And there was a a young boy in the class that was, one of his friends, came from, less fortunate financial background.
Mm-hmm.
And the teacher at the time, who was a tenured teacher, she would always use Michael as like the example in the classroom, which drove him absolutely batty.
Yes.
Nobody wants to be like the smart kid or the teacher's favorite or whatever, blah, 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 because other kids don't like that. But this teacher would not only do that, but shame the other students, like in front of the whole classroom, and had done this one time to his good friend. And the friend, I don't know, got like a D or something on some kind of report. And she just berated this child in front of the entire classroom. And had literally said, if you guys want to know, how to be smart, then copy Michael, type of a thing. And which was just mortifying. It literally set an unsafe environment for both children.
That's right.
And then the rest of the class, they're all looking like, terrified, because they don't want to be in either one of these shoes. So I don't want an A and I don't want an F. How much?
That's right.
But as you're saying that psychological safety, that has to be set by the teacher.
It absolutely does. And you're right, because what happens is, and I always talk about it from the brain perspective, because then we move away from the conversation of behavior and whether someone is good or bad behaviorally, right? We talk about how when there's not psychological safety, all of a sudden I'm worried about, oh my goodness, what are my friends going to think if they all believe I'm the teacher's pet? Or what are they going to think about me if I'm shamed and they're going to start picking on me? So then my brain kicks into all of that fight, flight, or freeze response. So not only does that impact your ability to connect and relate with your classmates and your teacher, but then how do you settle yourself back down to learn, right? I'll often, and I'll get back to your question, but I often use the example, just the simple example of if you're driving down the road and you're almost in a collision, a car accident, and you slam on your brakes, you know that feeling of adrenaline that runs through your body, and you feel it for a little bit of time. You might, everything's okay. You take off driving again, and you're watching every car like, you better stop, right? Don't hit me. And as adults, we're able to regulate that chemical flow that's happening in our bodies and eventually get ourselves back to a relaxed state. Imagine if you had to live in that state.
Right.
And then imagine if someone said, do algebra while you're feeling that rush of adrenaline in your body. This is a picture of what can happen in when we're not bringing psychological safety to the classroom. And it doesn't then turn into a conversation of picking on teachers. It's how much of a responsibility do we have to educate our educators about how impactful their role is as a teacher, and how much it's not just about what they're teaching, but they have to be aware of all of the verbal and nonverbal communication that comes into play, especially when we're dealing with children who've experienced a lot of trauma or live in toxic stress and are feeling already in this heightened state. So then that moves you into the conversation of, and what is our responsibility in looking at our education system and the unrealistic expectations that we're putting on teachers more and more. And now after COVID, even looking at the budget cuts that are coming for education and the pressure that our teachers feel. So it can feel like this spiraling out of control, but it's not. It's an opportunity to take a look at our system and say, we know what works. We know what can work. Now we have to look at this systematic issue and begin to actually be willing to do the hard work and address what is broken in that system, because we have now seen the effects on a generation and generations of children. And it's time to say, we know better, we do better. And we begin to bring in the practice of both emotional and intellectual intelligence. And we do it from a neuropsychological place, which then is so factual that it's not based on any one group of people or any one, concept or any behavior. It really is about what is the way that our brains and our hearts grow the best.
So good.
Well, and I think really, yes, COVID has had its obviously challenges, but I believe it's a gift because as parents, we've been frustrated with the education system and we've wondered what can we do about it and what are the teachers doing about it? And literally with the schools shut down, the parents are now the educators. And so now they get to be involved, more aware of what's going on and start thinking of other creative ways that they can bring into their schools once we open, have those solutions. But really, it's about doing something different because what we're doing is not working. And, I know for me personally, when Marion was talking about the epigenetics and how that affects a child, I don't know if you want to talk to that, Michelle or Ivy, but it really fascinated me because of these children that, come from, generations of trauma and it can impact a child from the very beginning of infancy.
Absolutely. And Ivy, I don't want to speak, you feel free to step up and share.
You're the guest. Can I go back real quick, just a couple of things, and then then you can talk about genetics. Melissa, your question about, what's going on in the world right now, right? Because think of a brain that's been fragmented and, doesn't have access to these cognitive capacities that Michelle's talking about. And you put that together with a system where the delivery of services is also incongruent and fragmented. And then, Michelle was pointing out about perspective and not even being able to have a freaking conversation. That's where we're at, right? Nobody knows how to talk to anybody without somebody going off. I'm part of, real quick, let me share this testimony if I can real quick. I have a partner in Canada. They're a EQ, emotional intelligence experts. They've created this gaming system called EQ to IQ. And so a couple of weeks ago, for this very, very reason, I reached out to the founder and I said, is there any way, what do you think of this? I just have this, Holy Spirit drops on me. What if you took a version of what your program and you made a prototype to help facilitate these conversations around racial inequity? In 72 hours, he had me a beta prototype. And on Saturday, we did it's called EQ to IQ, race to empathy. We did an orientation on Saturday. I invited we had 17 people on this Zoom call. And, talking about psychological safety. One of the gals, she's one of their trainers, and she works with athletes, and she's crying, sharing with us that she wanted to send a text to this African-American athlete to check on him, but she didn't know if she was going to use the right words in her text. We can't even we preface the orientation with this video. I won't put a direct link, Melissa. Don't worry, I will not put a direct link. That's a story, Michelle.
You're such a good rule follower, Dr. Ivy.
Okay. But anyway, so this African American gal and this guy and this white gal, they meet up. They're like walking around along, and they meet up. Oh, hey, and they start to talk, and the guy's like, but we can't talk about that. You know what I mean? And oh, but we can't talk about. You know what I mean? So totally set the stage. So we did this gameplay. We did breakout sessions, and we did these gameplays, and it was phenomenal. And people crying because exactly what Michelle's talking about and what we're trying to address. You got to have the emotional capacity to have a conversation, first of all. Yeah. And so if we're not doing this with these kids early on, and we have a education system that has done this on purpose. I'm sorry, they've done this. Has been intentional to keep a certain people group at a certain place. There's purpose for this. Anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, exactly. It's like, so, there's hope, but you're right on track because this is why we need to interrupt this. And we are, aren't we, Michelle?
So good.
We are, Dr. Ivy. Well, really, what we're talking about is this idea of when you break down our capacities to think and learn, you can delve deeper into the conversation. So our education system, because of legislation, really, has walked us to this place where we're teaching children to regurgitate information. We're not teaching them to think.
Yeah.
Come on.
Right?
You could
And
so,
so-
like rewind and put that on loop a few times.
Let's say it again.
If you can't regurgitate, then you don't, you know what I mean? You don't, you know.
Yes. So then that's right. Then how do we grow? How do we change systems, right? If we don't know how to think and we only know how to regurgitate what we're being told.
Right.
That is a whole interview in itself. But so what we have to do also, so you take that and kind of set that aside, and then we start having the conversation of epigenetics. I like to really simplify it for people and say it's this idea that we have neural pathways in our brain. That's the way that we think. Let me back up and say a neural pathway is almost like if you have fresh snow and you take a snowmobile and you drive it through the snow, you have a path that you'll easily want to take every time, right? Because you've built a pathway. And so you could consider that a pathway of thinking. And our brains are essentially lazy, so they kind of want to take that same pathway of thinking each time. But to build new neural pathways or a new behavior pattern or a new way of thinking, we have to build a new path in the snow. And essentially what happens is if you keep building that new path, it gets deeper and wider, and then that becomes your default thinking pattern. And the old will eventually die off. Now, again, this is new science and new understanding in the last really good 20 years. But so within those pathways, I'm talking now about epigenetics. Within those pathways, we have proteins. Within the protein is our DNA. Our DNA is stored within our thinking patterns. Think about that for a minute. And what's happening when we have an education system that teaches people to regurgitate information, and not, I don't want to generalize, right? Because we have a lot of good education systems and we are, we have a lot of good people and we're products of that. But if we're always seeking to do better and we know better, then we should do better. So for the sake of that conversation, we talk about what's happening with our DNA and what does that DNA look like as we pass those thinking patterns on to generations, right? And what happens when we're narrowing the brain by not teaching people how to think.
Right.
So we're getting a little bit away from social and emotional learning, but not really, right? Because when we don't teach our children how to think, then all of a sudden they're not growing in their interpersonal skills as well and how to engage interpersonally with each other. So let me just say it like this. Some of our thinking capacities, our cognitive capacities, are these abilities to focus and perceive, or to conserve consistencies, like to look around us and say, okay, what's constant? What remains the same? What's changing? How do I look for relevant cues around me and then define what's going on, not just academically, but also socially, what's going on around me? How do I think hypothetically about a situation to know what might be the best way that I interact with this person or I respond to them? How do I really get this grasp of reality and understand cause and effect?
Yeah.
How do I use abstract thinking in a situation to really understand what might come about, right? So I'm just throwing things out there, but how do I consider another point of view? How do I use precision and accuracy? Do you know that these are all concepts that are actually built in the thinking by neural pathways? So if those pathways aren't developed, if someone's not growing that in you as a young child, then who is growing it in you? And if those pathways of thinking aren't growing in us, in our education system that has a lot of influence over our kids. We're teaching children the majority of their day, then they're coming home, seeing their parents and going right to sports activities, or maybe everyone starts doing their own thing. And so there's minimal engagement in home. There's privilege deprivation, we call it. Then where are these pathways being built? How is the brain developing in such ways? And what we know now, because it's 2020, is that we can access information in 3 seconds in the push of a button. You can find out any information you want on Google, right?
Right.
But what do you do with that information?
Right.
What makes you a step ahead? It's being able to take that information and think with it, right? So not only are we talking about how we interact interpersonally and what we're passing on through epigenetics, but we also have to talk about what makes us successful as a human race, and how do we, continue to grow our children and keep them at the forefront of career and knowledge and experience. But back to epigenetics, we have to talk about this. We have to talk about what does it look like when there's inequality and equity in the brain, and how do we build it up? We go back to understanding that if we build up the cognitive capacities, the ability to think in certain ways, for example, hypothetically, then we know now that we have a level playing field. Yeah. If that makes sense.
So good.
It is so good, especially if you see generations of poverty, then it feels harder and harder to break those behavioral cycles. And in therapy, we say it often. We'll see families and we'll say, oh my goodness, I worked with your parent years ago and they looked the same behaviorally. Why? Because of that whole concept of epigenetics. And we have a responsibility, especially as women of faith, to break those generational cycles.
I've seen a couple of, comments, and this can seem like such a big, unattainable concept, right? Because people will try to say, well, there's, a million children. How are we going to come out, and teach a million different, children, blah, 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 blah. And that's not really the case. That's not what we're talking about. And there was a movie that I watched, and I shared a little bit on it. I don't know, it's probably a month, maybe 2 months ago, based on a true story called McFarland. And absolutely amazing. So I think it was Kevin Costner, so not good with labeling actors and actresses, but I think that's who it was the teacher who, got fired from some prestigious school, blah, 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 ends up in this small little farming community in the Central Valley in California. So like all, migrant farm worker type communities. And the school being, predominantly like Black and Hispanic, predominantly Hispanic, he became a track coach there. Not anything, grand, right? But he believed in these students, and the hope that he had given them was absolutely amazing. But this one scene in particular, these kids would literally wake up before dawn with their parents, go out and work the fields, hustle straight from the field to school, and then after school, go back to the field. And they had to do this in order to help put, food on the table for their family, right? And one of the dads was pulling them, because they got involved in track, and pulling them out of track because he's like, no, you got to go work the fields, right? Because we got to put food on the table, et cetera, et cetera. And the show was really amazing. Actually, the teacher came and worked in the fields one day because he's like, I'll help make the difference, right, for these kids. Got his butt kicked, which is the whole nother thing. This privileged white man who'd never done any kind of farm labor at all was, sucking wind in an hour. But that's another story. But eventually, because these kids they took state championships with track, got scholarships to college. And this child goes to his dad, right? And he's talking to him kind of tentatively about wanting to go to college.
Mm.
And the dad fires back at him like, that's absolutely ridiculous. That's ludicrous. No book, no education is going to help you be a better farm worker.
Wow.
The concept of not being a farm worker was nowhere in their DNA.
Right.
His mind was, how in the world is that going to help you be a better farm worker?
Yeah.
And this teacher actually had given this child hope of something more. And I think that is, some of the things in the inequality that we're seeing in the education system is so many of these children who don't have educated parents, don't have people around them. So their mentality is, why even try? Because education's not going to help me, work at the, car wash or whatever, or in their parents' small business. Maybe they've got a little liquor store or something like that. And, that's not going to help me, be better at that. In that the teacher, one teacher, and literally it completely turned this whole school. If you guys watch the movie McFarland, it's absolutely amazing. One teacher.
Well, you're talking about two things, right?
Yeah, literally changed the entire future of that school to where they were on state stage, for athletics. And at the end of the movie, it's, talking about where all of these different students ended up being in careers in life and, professionals. And I mean, literally mind blowing. So when people are thinking, oh, this is way too big to tackle, if we literally had, one teacher in every school that held this close and near and dear to their heart, what the ripple effect,
Well, that's absolutely right. You're talking about two things. First, you're talking about taking what we do is we teach kids to think so that they can take any type of content and evolve it, right? And so that's a shift that has to happen in our system, but that can also happen for parents. So if you're a parent and you're listening, when you stop giving your child the answers and you use a questioning process in their day-to-day engagement, you're teaching them to try to figure out what to do with the knowledge and the environment around them. So you're starting to develop that in your children, and you can foster that type of engagement in your home. But then you also have to look at one of the most important factors, which is relationship. Right. Because relationship really dictates that psychological safety, right? And we know, all the research tells us that just one caring adult can impact a child so much that they can then become resilient or overcome. Because really, when you speak about resiliency and you speak about trauma and you speak about brain underdevelopment, it's really this idea that children need the model of someone helping them to regulate their brain chemicals so that they can jump into a ready state of learning. So if you're that adult that models for them what it feels like to relax and feel safe after a big scary event. Let's say a child has a really rough morning, mom or dad yells a lot, or there was a fight in the home, or there wasn't a lot of sleep, and then that child comes to school and they're highly dysregulated. If you're that one adult that models through your behavior and your nonverbal communication how to relax, and then also we have mirror neurons in our brains developed to copy kind of one another, then your mirror neurons are signaling to a child how to find a regulated state. That in itself can impact a child for a lifetime. This is why we have to be training and teaching our educators this type of knowledge and understanding. We can't just focus anymore on just that intellectual intelligence. And so that takes you to the systematic issue of how are our education systems, our schools at a building level? What does the competition look like? And how does that impact learning? How are we setting up our classrooms? How are you as a teacher setting up your classroom so that kids can kind of learn in this place of safety, right? So that there's relational engagement, not just between teacher and student, but between peer and peer, and also between coworker and coworker, educator and educator. And not that we, then people start to say, oh, like we're not going to sissify people. And, like you get into that whole conversation of pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Well, you can't say that when you start to think about brain science, right? We have to talk about how important relationship is on building resilience in the brain and stopping or halting those negative thinking patterns and really modeling what it looks like to have a growth mindset.
Yeah.
So we can do this. We can do this in an education setting. We can do it by educating our teachers. We can do it by legislative change. And we can do this also in our young people by educating parents on what their part can be at home. And it doesn't have to be teaching math. It can actually be in the ways that you engage with your child that will set them up for better learning in the academic environment.
Right. Well, I think the modeling is huge because, kids, they model what they see. And so I know there's a lot of talk about just the bullying that's happening in schools. And every parent just jumps on the bandwagon of my kid's getting bullied, my kid's getting bullied. But they don't realize is what they are modeling at home or maybe in front of the children is essentially bullying as well. And so these kids see the disrespect, the behavior that adults are having with one another, and they think that's okay. Right. And so it's like your heart has to go out to the one that is being bullied, of course, but also the one that's bullying, because there's something going on in their life that they are trying to wrestle with. Well, that's how I see people being treated. How is that not okay? And it's just the whole, if I'm in pain, you'll be in pain type thing. And so I think us as adults, we do have to take responsibility. And look at society right now. Hatred is just rampant. About just every issue. And these children, these innocent children, are caught in the middle of this. And they're the ones that are going to be leading our future. And so I think it's such an important time right now, which I feel like is such a gift that these kids are learning, Michelle, just what you're saying, how to become resilient, because they have to deal with disappointment right now. Their life is completely flipped upside down. They can't blame it on someone. Every child, unfortunately, if they were a senior, didn't get a graduation. It wasn't just, I couldn't afford it or my parents didn't give me a party. It's just like every child is dealing with some level of disappointment, which gets me excited because our prayer has been, how is the resiliency of our next generation? Where's it going to come from?
Yeah.
So it's like, if we can think of it with that perspective, that this is such an opportune time to rewire our brain, to start thinking. Even as adults, I think we've forgotten how to think. We just listen to what the media is telling us or what everybody else is saying. And if they're going upstream, we're just going to swim upstream with them.
Oh, that's absolutely true. Absolutely. I love to think about it in this sense, right? So I'm just using this hypothetical thought that I have sometimes. We want to fall into, oh my goodness, things are getting so bad or we're so much worse. And I often like to think about, but could it be that we're on this evolution of humanity in the sense that generationally, it was never okay to be an individual. And we followed rules even when we weren't happy, right? As human beings, we just did what was right. Then we move into the evolution of wanting to think for ourselves, which means we actually have to make mistakes and mess up so that we can bring ourselves back. It is the science of learning. If you don't mess up, you don't learn. And so, is there balance to that? Yes. Am I saying that's exactly all right? No. But I do like to think about and find hope in this idea that, okay, if we go to extremes in some ways, we mess up, then we come back and we learn how to build resilience. But there has to be something there, a system, a person, whatever it might be, that is that grounding for us. But you're right. In the environment where there's bullying, who's helping us learn to regulate that brain chemical state? So we can talk to our children and actually teach them about their brains, and say, when you feel this response in your body, it's because this is happening in your mind, and you actually have control over that. So no longer does it become about a person and how they're treating you. It becomes about your own heart work and how you learn to manage yourself. And that's really where our responsibility lies, in teaching children to focus on the responsibility that they have internally, right? Because we can't control people around us. Right. And so that's a conversation in itself. But when we talk about bullying, we also have to say this out loud, and it doesn't make me friends with a lot of people, but we have to talk about how our systems bully people. And Melissa, you were hitting on that a little bit earlier too. Our system, the setup of our system, the stress that adults are under, and then how they engage with children and how they engage with each other in educational settings absolutely impacts our children. Modeling is key. When we talk about it in therapeutic practices, we know that modeling is so much more powerful than any words. As a matter of fact, we can talk at people and it doesn't bring a lot of change. It's the modeling that brings change. So when you therapeutically work with parents, you teach them everything you do is what your children learn from. So then when you apply that to an education setting, we have a responsibility to focus on what's happening with adults in that setting, to say you're modeling for children. So it's not just coming from the home, which is what we always want to put on families, but we have to say, what is the culture of this building, and how do we begin to take responsibility for the culture in our education settings? And then what are we doing to shift that culture from adult down?
You know, you're talking about resiliency and then a couple of things. So a couple of things I want to hit on. First of all, resiliency, also grit, right? I love the whole concept of needing to build resiliency. You know, again, we have this dichotomy in the United States of children that probably have a little too much resiliency because they're in constant survival mode. And then, you know, whether it's, you know, they're in a, you know, gang infested area and there's bullets always going around, or, you know, they're having to take care of their younger siblings because mom and dad's not around, or, you know, a significant amount of resiliency, but, you know, like the strength overextended type of a thing that can become a weakness. And then we have this other end of the spectrum that we've seen, you know, going on at the same time, of children being raised without the need of any resiliency, because they're all going to get a trophy. They're all going to win. You know, mom and dad may be off doing their things, but they're placating them with a ton of electronics and games and, you know, and all this kind of stuff. And I saw not to make a whole story out of a video clip, because that drives me nuts too, but saw a video. I know. Anyway, so I'm going to go there. So this video clip of this white gal, and she's standing in front of a black police officer in riot gear. And she's, you know, yelling and screaming at him, and he's just like, you know, blank face. And she has this like pool noodle or something. And she's hitting him over the head, hitting him over his helmet, you know, with a pool noodle. And I'm like, I'm not getting this. And he finally just raises his hand and like knocks the pool noodle. It knocks it out of her hand. She goes into full blown meltdown. Like, I had to hit the sound really quick because the screeching and devastation, and threw herself to the ground because he knocked the pool noodle out of her hand. Like, I'm like, literal, the extreme of no resiliency, right? And we have done that as adults and leaders in our society. We've created this dichotomy of, now adults who have been raised in non-nurturing, non-protective homes, or overly, if you will. And so we have, resiliency overextended to where they're just in this constant, stuck open fight and flight mode, right? Because we know that can get stuck open. And then, the other extreme, and now they're, as adults, coming in conflict with each other. And that's really all on us as adults, as leaders that have created this dichotomy of sorts that's going on in the world. And therefore we can't look at the children as if they have to resolve the issue. Right.
Well, and that's that narrowing of the thinking, right? So if I'm always thinking in one extreme or the other, instead of building the capacity to think on my own and to process through a situation, then I don't have all of those pathways built to like default to, oh, maybe I should use this skill set in this time. It's just, oh, my response is I have a meltdown that gets me what I want, right? Like, if we're just generalizing. So how do we build our thinking process? That's why I always take it back to what's happening in our brains. And also, yes, like this whole idea of growth mindset versus fixed mindset. Okay. So essentially that could be used in the example that you just gave. And if you're a parent listening, you look up and you teach your children how to use a growth mindset. It goes right hand in hand with what we're talking about. But you have to model how to have a growth mindset. And that's what's happening is we're not modeling that. Our media doesn't model that, right? What we're exposed to so often doesn't model it. As parents, we're exhausted from the demand that society puts on us, and we're not modeling it. We have a need in society for hard work. And so all of that plays into someone's ability to really think through situations. With growth mindset would say, with this idea of, I can do this. I will persevere through this. I can't do it yet versus I'll never be able to do it. So how we respond as adults, even adult to adult, can really model for someone, oh, you're going to have a meltdown. Well, let's think through this right now. What could your option be differently? And so, again, it goes back to that narrowing of our thinking patterns. And because in our education, just to take it full circle, our education systems have such an influence on our children. We have a responsibility to begin to push back as parents and as educated individuals and say, how are we going to focus on this type of brain development in our children? And again, because it's 2020 and we're teaching kids to regurgitate information that they can Google in 2 seconds. So what does bring us ahead and keep us, evolving as a race? It's the ability to interact and engage in emotionally intellectual ways. And to keep building our brains.
Terms, kind of wrapping, I know we have to wrap this up, and I can totally see that we've got like 10 other interviews we have to do now. And so obviously we need to bring this into educating the educators so then they can then model this and bring this to the children. But on the flip side, how are we in practical terms bringing this to the ones that are no longer in the education system, the adults? Right? Because if we have no adults modeling this, we will not have children walking it out. So how do we get it out to the adults that don't have these pathways because they have grown up already in the education system that is, handed them, that have snowplowed their pathways. How do we get it to the adults?
Yeah, I mean, what a great question, right? We should really brainstorm around that. What does it look like in society? Some of the work that I've been branching out into is what does it look like to offer this type of training to our at our community levels? How do we go into a community system and say to employers, you're struggling with employee retention, you're struggling with, your employees having skill sets and coming to work on time. We begin to build cognitive capacity and we take on that responsibility in the private sector, knowing that it will bring us return because we'll get more of that output. Because again, if you're thinking about it from the neurological place, you're understanding that I want to say sometimes essentially it can feel like we're dumbing down the brain, not always. Again, I'm generalizing for the conversation, but so, and then how do we reach communities with this? How do people like you and Julie in the work that you're doing push back against the pressure and stand up for speaking to people in ways that make them think? Right. Yeah. And often we can get pushback for that. Mm-hmm. How do you use the questioning process more in the work that you're doing instead of talking at people? So there are ways for us to do this, but it requires the conversation of even what's happening in our media and how are the messages that we're being sent through our news, through movies, through video games, all of that molds and shapes our thinking, whether we know it or not. And so how do we as adults take the responsibility to push back in that way as well? Mm-hmm. Yeah. In the little bits that we can. How do we do that in our church environments, right? How do we do that in our settings of faith? How do we do that at community meetings? And it doesn't have to be confrontational. How do we do it through the picture of love? Because actually nothing is a more powerful force of change than love and helping people evolve to the place where they feel powerful in their thinking.
Yeah. And this, now I have 11 different interviews because literally, I mean, the church is supposed to be on the forefront of bringing healing and all this other stuff, right, to the nation. So I'm like, oh my gosh.
Oh, and girlfriend,
can I say something real quick?
Sunday schools talking about Noah and Jonah. How about having Sunday schools around, like emotional intelligence? But anyway, sorry.
Melissa, I could talk about that forever. And actually the scriptures give us a good model of exactly what we're talking about. So yes, let's get that next interview scheduled.
Right. Yeah. Dr. Ivy, what were you going to say?
When you're talking about so many variables, so I mean, you can talk about it from the perspective that Michelle is presenting, and that's good, but you're talking about so many different variables. And I just want to make a point that, when, the educators and the parents are children on lockdown in adult bodies. So, so we have to remember that. And also they haven't dealt with their trauma. And when you don't deal with things we like in the church, especially in the church, you know what I mean? What is that? Casting all things that look before, behind me, going for, whatever the verse is. But if we haven't processed it and,
dealt with it,
assimilated it into then you haven't, and that's not resilience. You know what I mean? Survival and resilience is not the same thing.
No,
exactly. You're able to bounce back from something. You're able to frame it. You know what I mean? That's resilience. Although I look resilient, people look resilient, they're still in survival mode. So
right. And I didn't mean to say that the kids
clear for anybody listening. That's not the same thing. Right.
Yeah, no, and I didn't mean to infer that the kids that are in survival mode are resilient,
right.
But my experience lately in some of the conversations that I have had, and I know we're going to have to wrap this up, but with the Black community and them sharing some of their stories, and I have said, I'm absolutely amazed at the amount of grace they're able to extend. Like me, who had said, I didn't have a lens for it. The amount of love that they're able to extend, those are resilient people. That have been oppressed, that have been put down, and yet they're able to come back and stand in grace and love and forgiveness, and let's build bridges and let's move forward. So that's where I'm coming from as far as that resilience. But when I'm talking about the overextended, it's like those are the things that can create resilience, but they don't come back from it. They're now, like you said, in survival mode. But
so So I have a question. So as we wrap up, I mean, Dr. Ivy and Michelle, what are some resources and tools that you would suggest the viewers listening to check out? I know for us, we use a lot of Dan Siegel stuff of Mind Institute, but I didn't know if there were any ones that you would recommend. I mean, Ivy, obviously your information, and then Michelle, how can people find out more about what you're doing as well?
Yeah, there's so many resources out. I'm trying to think. I often use a lot of books, even my very Elastic Brain for Children. You can buy that on Amazon and begin to teach your children about their brains and empower them at that level. And so often, and also like growth mindset. So I really appreciate Dr. Siegel's work. I actually was listening to quite a bit of it this morning because he's just really such a lead. And so his work on parenting, as well as just in general, the neuropsychological work he does is very powerful. I often follow a lot of Dr. Ruben Feuerstein's work through the Feuerstein Institute out of Israel, because they are doing some groundbreaking progressive work, and there's tons and tons of research out about that. And also Harvard has their site for child resiliency and trauma. So, parents, adults, educators can start to look into Harvard's site. I'm trying to think of the name of it. Dr. Ivy, do you know, is it the Center for Resilience? Harvard's Child Center for Resilience, I believe it is, if you just Google it. You can start there. That's a lot of information to begin with. And it's really just about how do you begin to teach your child to think. If you just got the growth mindset information and started to build growth mindset in your children, that would build a desire in them for more and more learning. And to really, lastly, I'll say, view them through that lens of neurodevelopment instead of behavior. And judging through the position of behavior. And so that goes for, we're viewing our educators through that perspective and understanding the level of stress they're under, and our educators viewing children from that perspective and understanding the level of trauma and stress that those children are under, and really educating yourselves about trauma and how that really impacts the functioning of individuals.
Yeah, no, that's
good. And lastly, I just want to say what Dr. Ivy said is so important and could be a whole conversation in itself. We're talking, we're branching off all over here in this conversation. So narrowing it back down and focusing on some specific themes, Dr. Ivy, you're absolutely right. Changes the tone and changes the conversation a little bit. So yeah. So this is a good introduction.
Yeah, this is our SWOT benefit.
That's right.
There's our pellets going out all over here, and then I feel like we need to do little follow-ups on this pellet and that pellet, and So Dr. Ivy, one more time, why don't you let people know how to find you and reach out to you and all that kind of good stuff too?
Yeah, no, just my website is Every Child Whole. Think of God's heart. That's it. I was kidding. Everychildwhole.com. So it's where the information is. And and Michelle and I are going to be working together more in the future. We're actually got some things we're talking about right this minute. So more to come.
Yes. And you can reach me for some individual, community, business, and educational consulting at resilientmindsconsulting.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Ladies, you are such a blessing. This has been so informative. And just so many seeds, so many, my brain's feeling
you're thinking
right now. It's like, woo! But so thank you so much, and have a blessed day. And everybody in THV Nation, we will see you tomorrow.
Yes, bye-bye.